All right, friends and neighbors, welcome back to another networking video. Today we're going to compare iperf version 2 and iperf version 3. And we'll do some tests, so I'll talk about it, and then we'll do a test, and I'll talk about it, and then we'll do a test. And maybe I'll show you something cool for each one of them. And then I got a little surprise for you at the end. Okay, so here we go, iperf2 versus iperf3. Now, since we're going to actually run some tests, I thought I would point out the topology that I'm going to use. So really, most of this is going to be about a couple of VMs going back and forth. They are going to be Ubuntu VMs, so Linux. And the two of them are sitting on a NAT network. And I'll show you that you can actually talk to your host PC too, at least in one direction. And you can see that I've got the two IP addresses there, 10.0.2.15. That'll be our client. And then 10.0.2.16 will be our server. So that's kind of our topology. Second up on the installation, since we're going to do iperf2 and iperf3, both of those programs live on each VM. And so how this installation went, right, if you just do a base install of iperf, and then you'll get iperf2. And if you want iperf3, then you just do in my case, sudo apt-get install iperf3. And I just sort of highlighted, it just shows you the packages that you're actually getting installed. So be mindful of what you're doing, and you'll also see the versions that you're getting with the install as well. And third, we're going to do some with options today, and since they don't look the same, we have to manipulate iperf2 a little bit to get it to look like our familiar iperf3 output. But if you do --help, you'll get a lot of information about all the options. Some of the options are for the client, some of the options are for the server, and then some of the options can run on either one of them. This printout is just a sample, so it's not all of them. And they're different between the two versions. Okay, so the first thing that I'll point out before we run our first test is they do not run the same. And so what you're seeing here is that on the right-hand side right here, this is our normal way of running iperf. And this is sort of the output that we get, right? And so we're used to, the default being 10 seconds. You can change that. And then you get your intervals. And then you get the overall transfer and then how fast things were going. Now we'll be a little mindful. Remember that these are VMs. And so it's not actually running across a real network. It's just internal. And so the results that I'm going to get here are not what you're going to get on a real network. Okay. And then here's the default run of iperf2. And you can see that it really doesn't give you a lot of stuff. It just says, well, here's the results at the end. And there's also the thing, I guess I'll remind you about this early, is that there is a difference between what you see in terms of information when the two of them run. So here we've got information about the default window size, and you sort of have to look that up in iperf3. And then if I want iperf2 to look like iperf3, then what I'm going to do is add the interval. And what the interval does is just a reporting function that says, I want you to give me a printout, in this case, every second. Okay, so let's actually run a test and see what that looks like. So here's our server. Let's check in on its IP address. We can see that this one is 2.16, and I'm just going to run iperf3. Whoops. And we'll just run it as a server for right now. Okay, so that's what we have running. Let's go over to the client. So here's our client. And the first thing we'll do is we'll just run an iperf3 default test, right, -c, and then we're going to say we're going to go over to 2.16. And we can see that it's spitting back a result every second. And then at the end, it's going to say, oh, by the way, here was your information. Now, while I'm here, I'm also going to show you something else about iperf3 that's different with iperf2. If I want to run UDP, right? So right now, this default is going to be a TCP test. And if you did the capture on it, you would see all the TCP packets go. But I could also, from right here, change this to -u, right? And what this does is it converts it to a UDP test. Oops. So I'll leave the oops in there. You got to put the IP address first, and then the options go after that. Okay, so the point of this is that I just ran the server once, right? And then I ran a TCP test, and then I ran a UDP test, and that's with iperf3. Now I'll also point out here that why would you run a UDP test? And that's because really what we're after, the big deal, is that we want to do jitter. And if you remember, jitter is the variation between expected and actual arrival times on your packet traffic. Okay, so that is iperf3. Let's go back over to our server. We're going to shut it down. We're going to run an iperf2 server. Okay, so the server is terminated. We're just going to up arrow on this, and we're just going to run straight iperf2, or just iperf, which is iperf2. There we go. All right, so we'll move this up a little bit, separate the two, and now we're going to run our client, but this time I'm going to change it to iperf alone. So this will be an iperf2 test. And we can see that we're sending to TCP port 5000. All right. Oh, and it just said that's what I'm doing. I am running your 10-second test, and this is what you're going to get out of this. Okay, so now if we wanted to change that, again, TCP, so now we're going to say is, now I could get away with dash, I think I can get away with dash I on that side, but we'll be consistent. And, well, we'll see if iperf will let me be consistent. There we go. And we can see that now it's mirroring the behavior of iperf3. So this is one report every second, and then a final version at the end. Now, this gets it to look like iperf3, but we have to sort of identify that iperf3 sort of skips a line, right? And then gives me this report at the end. And so if we scroll up a little bit. Okay, so we get this report at the end, right? It says, here's my last 1 second, and then here's your final report. All right, let's compare that to what iperf2 just did. iperf2 sort of munged them all together. Said, oh, here's your last 10-second report. So, you know, you gotta extract that detail out. Okay. Now what happens if I say, well, iperf, I would like a UDP test at this point. So it's trying. It's trying. We'll see what happens. Da-da-da-da. Oh, connection failed. And that's because in iperf2, on the server side, you got to say this is the kind of server that we want to be. So let's go do that. So we're back on our server again, and now we're going to say to iperf, listen, I would like you to be a UDP server. Let's go back over to our client. All right, we're going to try the same test that we just did. Da-da-da-da-da. There we go. All right, so there was our UDP test. And the nice thing about iperf2, even though this is a little clunky, right? We have to go back and forth a little bit. We got to change the way the interface does. There are a couple other things that I'll point out on iperf2. You know, we have this problem with the alignment. So iperf3 does a little bit better job on the output. So they worked on that a little bit. But iperf2 does sometimes give us more information about what happened without us having to ask. I mean, take a look at what we've got here. Sending 1470 byte datagrams. The target, we got a timing associated with this. And then the number of datagrams that we actually sent. Instead of just saying, okay, here was the totals and then your actual jitter. So that I would put on iperf2's side, that it gives us a little bit more information. Okay, so let's talk about what's next for our comparison. So again, what did we just do? Well, when we wanted iperf2 to look like iperf3, then what we did is we said, well, we're going to add the interval line. And then that gets it to look like, you know, the output. Now when we're doing jitter, right, I mentioned this quickly during the tests, but jitter is the difference between actual and expected arrival time. So when you're getting a stream of packets, and this is particularly important when you got real-time data, right? So when you're dealing with voice over IP or video, and you want consistent performance, what we're after is low jitter numbers. So jitter very commonly can be a couple of milliseconds, and all that means is that when you're getting a packet stream, you sort of expect one after another, right? But if we start to get large variations in delay, the next packet was 1 millisecond, and then the one that was after that, I got 10 milliseconds later, then what it does is affects our performance. It gives unstable or unpredictable performance, and that's what we don't want. Okay, so that's what jitter's all about. That's why you would want to measure it, and then over here we can see that iperf3 does a little bit better job on formatting. But when we're taking a look at what the iperf versions provide, right? If we take a look at the beginning of iperf3, it says I'm connecting and we're going to do a UDP stream, and then, I transferred data. But iperf2 says, well, listen, here's what I'm going to do during the transfer. So, if you can get your formatting and get your intervals correct, maybe you prefer the iperf2 output. I will also say that both of them offer output options for what you want things to look like. So don't just go by what's here. Do a little experimentation. Okay, so what's next? Well, something cool in iperf2. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to say, well, what are some of the options? And I'll show you really quick, and then we'll do an example. So this one here happens to be an iperf test. Again, I've set the interval to a little smaller, and then, well, to a little bit larger than the 1 second, but smaller than the 10 second. And we're going to do histograms. And so let's take a look at what that looks like. So we're going to shut down our server. We're not going to do -u anymore. And let's go over to our client. So first, we'll do if you just do iperf and it says, well, listen, if you want more information, then do the --help. This is very common in Linux, right? /? does it in Windows. And look at all of these available options, right? So way up here is where I actually did the --help. And you can see that we've got a lot of client-server options, server-specific, client-specific. There we go. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to say, well, geez, I liked that idea. So we're going to do a -i2. Oh, I was going to be consistent, wasn't I? So -c 10.02.16 -i2. So this is going to give me, over the course of 10 seconds, I'll get 5 individual reports. And then I'm going to do --histograms. Now this doesn't actually print out a histogram. That would be kind of cool, but that's asking a little bit much. And so I'm going to, where am I getting this? I am getting this from right here. There we go. So right here, enable latency histograms. So this is statistical data that you would bring back out of iperf and then, manipulate it however you wanted to do that. But it also requires something else. We have to do TCP write prefetch, right? It'll warn us that if you try to do histograms, I'll do it, but I'm not really going to do it unless you also set this one. And then we got to give it a byte value. So it's a more complicated version. You really have to sort of want this. So what we're going to do is histograms, and then we're going to do the TCP write prefetch. So that's down here. So we're going to do TCP write prefetch, and then I'm going to give it a value. I'm just going to pick a value here, 10,000 bytes, and then off we go. So you can see that every 2 seconds, and maybe we'll make our window bigger here in a second, but it's clearly providing additional data. So we'll just make our windows a little bit bigger. I know, hopefully that you can see this. If you're on a phone, I feel a little bit bad about that because the text is not all that great. But if we look at an individual test, right, one of these reports. So here's a 2-second test. The histogram stuff is right here, and it's providing a lot of detail about our latency values. So you would have to extract this, and then to actually get meaning out of it, then maybe you'll say, well, what are the actual documents say? Now the other thing that I'll point out here, I've got it on the slide too, but I'll point it out while we're here, is that here is detail about what's actually going. The write buffer size, right? The type or class of service that's on there, that's in the IP header. Today we call it differentiated services code bits. And then we've got our TCP window size. Now this is interesting because the window size can vary quite a bit over the course of a connection and also between connections. So you can take a look at that. Okay, so that is iperf2. Well, now let's do something cool with iperf3. And iperf3, what we're going to do is just, there's lots of options, right? We could have picked anything here. I'm just going to add -v. Now, -v, whether you're doing a server or TCP dump, usually means increase the verbosity. And that's actually what it does here too. And it gives us a little more detail about what we're doing with this iperf connection. And so in this particular slide, I pointed out two things, right? We've got detail about our connection, right? We actually get a cookie here that goes across. That's in the packets or in the connection file that iperf uses. And then we've got a TCP maximum segment size, 1448. Where does that number come from? Well, if you think about Ethernet is 1500 bytes, and then we have a 20 byte IP header, so that's 1480, and then we have a 20 byte TCP header, but it's 20 bytes plus whatever option. So at best, we'd be looking at 1460, but if we have three options, that will be 12 bytes that are taken out, so that probably gives us our 1448. Okay, and then we've got detail about our client window over here, and then maybe all the way down here. Look at this CPU utilization. What is that about? Local and sender, remote. So this maybe gives us a little more detail about what's happening on the two sides. And what else is iperf doing on the machine? How is it getting this information? And then maybe even we've got stuff about congestion. Now TCP has an ECN bit that you can set, the explicit congestion notification. It's another RFC that's out there, but there we have it. So let's actually run the test and we'll see what happens. So we'll make sure that we're iperf3 first of all. There we go. So now we're running a server iperf3. So now we're going to run an iperf3 test. iperf3-c 10.02.16, and we're going to add the -v option. And we can see at the beginning here we've got all this additional information, and then the crazy CPU utilization. In addition to the network traffic that went across the way, we can also see that I've got stuff about the hosts. Well, as long as we're here, let's try one more thing. Can I go to the Windows host? Remember that we're talking to two VMs that are here, and so can I ping out to the host machine? Oops, that's not it. Now this host machine is running the hypervisor, right? So we can communicate out when we're natted. Communicating in is a little more different. Actually, maybe we'll talk about NAT this week too. But let's run iperf3, and instead of going, I happen to have a server running on the client or the host machine too, the Windows 11 host machine. And so we'll just do this real quick. Maybe I shut down my server. So let me check that real quick. There's our problem. I was running a server that was iperf2. So I guess we'll do both. So we'll just change this to iperf like that. There we go. Now I didn't do the interval, so we're going to sit here and camp again. I should do the interval. It's much more interesting to look at reports as they come back. There it is. Okay. And now we'll just, so that shows you that you can connect from a host behind the NAT connection on a hypervisor out to the host, and that you can run between Linux and Windows. So that's an important detail. And maybe we'll just do the iperf3 for fun. Okay, there's our iperf3 server, and that'll do it. Okay, so again, Linux to Windows, and we're behind an app box. Well, let's go back to our server again. So this is our server window, and on the server side, right, it spits out the same detail, but I'm going to watch this. Now, I just shut down the server, just Control-C. No big deal, except that sometimes on a Windows box, iperf2 does not want to shut down. It's very, very challenging to actually get iperf2 to shut down from the command line or with an interrupt, and so sometimes we wind up closing the window. So that was actually a frustration with iperf2. On Windows, anyway. Okay, one last thing before I go. We used to use a thing called jperf. Now, jperf is sort of a wrapper that goes around iperf, and it provides graphical data. It's a graphical interface, too, or a GUI. So you can see at the top here that you have some fields that you can fill in, and then it prints out this really nice sort of graph for you. Now you can take the data from iperf and do the exact same thing yourself, but jperf is out there and I thought I would mention it, so that's your little surprise for today. Here is where you can go out there and get the source files and see about the releases. The last time it was updated was 2014 and 2015. It's a little out of vogue because it's an extra thing you have to do, and I prefer to work on the command line. But they did some work and it actually works pretty well, so try it out if you want some graphical data. Well, my goodness, I think that'll about do it for the iperf stuff. We've done a lot with iperf, and I hope that you enjoy the content. I think our next thing, we're going to do some NAT stuff, but there we go. Remember that iperf is great for testing. There are differences between iperf2 and iperf3. You can get iperf2 to look like iperf3. A lot of the stuff in iperf2 is deprecated, so it wasn't easy to get histograms out of iperf3, for example. So depending on what you're trying to do, right, maybe you choose your version. The formatting is a little bit better on iperf3, I think. Maybe a little more stable in operation. So I guess it just really depends on what you're trying to do. But there we have it. Hey, like and subscribe if I added to your iperf life. And no matter what kind of testing you're doing, TCP, UDP, iperf, version 2, version 3, jperf, may those testing packets always reach their destination.